So please give a very warm welcome to Professor Rodney Chrisman.
Thank you all, and it is a privilege and an honor to be here with you this afternoon. I'm going to talk about the title that I sent in for the talk is A Christian Critique of Law and Economics. I almost picked a more attention-grabbing title. I'd considered, and maybe we could even use this as the subtitle, Why is Rape a Crime? And other questions that America's dominant jurisprudential thought system gets wrong. So I guess knowing that Moscow Christchurch and Pastor Wilson et al. Are often surrounded by controversy, maybe I just decided to take it easy on everybody and went with the less controversial title. But like I say, maybe we can plug that one in. I am going to answer that question as we go through that. So I'm going to jump right in with what is law and economics. My guess is most of you have never heard of that before. Raise your hand if you've heard of law and economics. Okay, that's what I expected. Most people have never heard of law and economics, but law and economics is the dominant jurisprudential thought system in the United States. So what is jurisprudential or jurisprudence? Jurisprudence is just merely philosophy of law. That's really what it means. So the philosophy of how we should approach law and legal questions, law and economics is the dominant theory in the United States, and the vast majority of Americans have never heard of that theory. There's a number of quotes I could give you to demonstrate that. I'm just going to share one from a guy named Brian Bix, who writes a jurisprudential book that is used across America quite a bit in schools of government and in law schools. He says this: the current influence of law and economics can be seen in the way that even those highly critical of that approach use its terminology and respond to the issues it raises. There's a sense in which law and economics now sets the agenda, or at least offers the initial framework for most discussions of policy and reform in the American academic, legal, and political debate. I would submit to you that when you have provided the terminology and you've set the terms or the framework of the debate, you have taken the field. So you've reached a point of dominance when everybody at least has to talk using your terminology and your terms. So what does law and economics do? I find it helpful always when I'm considering something to consider what's the purpose of it. So what is the purpose of law and economics? What is law and economics trying to accomplish? So law and economics, in looking at law and policy, what it is trying to do is maximize societal wealth. So the goal of law and economics is to maximize societal wealth. That thought is appealing to people in our time because it avoids what Judge Richard Posner calls controversial metaphysical commitments. Richard Posner recently retired. He's for years the Chief Judge of the United States Supreme Court for the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. He is a polymath. He is a brilliant guy. He has published a number of books, and he is probably the leading proponent in America still of the law and economics view. So Judge Posner, I use that controversial metaphysical commitments because that comes from another book of his where he is talking about why he is not worried about Jesus Christ or modern Christians, because modern Christians have controversial metaphysical commitments that he said can never influence the modern secular courts. So he doesn't care what Christians think. He doesn't care what Christ has to say, because that can't influence modern secular courts because of these controversial metaphysical commitments. Now, I admittedly do, from his perspective, have controversial metaphysical commitments. I think that God would be my first, I guess, controversial metaphysical commitment. I think he has spoken. I think he is the sovereign creator of the universe, and therefore he has the right to basically tell us what to do, say what is right and wrong and good, and what is bad and not good. And therefore, he gets to set what the terms of our law and policy should be. From the position of his own declared neutrality, Judge Posner would reject those foundations, and he declares them to be controversial. And he says, well, we can replace it with this. We live in an age where we're so divided, we can't agree. So we can replace it with this. Can't we all agree we're better off if we're richer? So just listen to us, set policy and legal standards according to what we tell you, and it'll make everybody richer. All right, so how do we accomplish that goal then? So I'm trying to give you a little feel for what law and economics is like before I tell you how it answers why is rape wrong, and other questions to the extent we've got time to get to them. How does it accomplish this goal? So it accomplishes this goal basically by attempting to apply microeconomic theory to really all the questions of life in a way. It's almost a philosophical system where you apply microeconomic theory to answer these types of questions. So generally speaking, what we're trying to do then is get resources into the hands of people who value them the most. Because if we can do that, that means those resources are efficiently deployed. And when they're efficiently deployed, meaning that we've got them allocated in such a way that no other allocation would bring about a greater amount of wealth, then we know we've maximized society's wealth. How do we do that? How do we know if someone values a resource more than someone else? Well, the answer is, in an effort to avoid utilitarianism, law and economics scholars say that we should get it into the hands of the person who is willing and able to pay the most for it. So willing and able to pay the most for it. That's how we do that. In other words, we want to do that through voluntary market transactions. Now, I'm going to say at a couple points in this, there's a lot of things in law and economics that I don't have any problem with. I love free markets. I think God loves free markets. So I'm all for free markets. Those are wonderful things. So an example of these voluntary transactions in a free market would be as if I had an extra copy of Posner's book and you come to Liberty University School of Law and take my class there where I teach law and economics, which I very much want you to do. That's part of why I'm all the way out here from Lynchburg, Virginia, right? So if you come and do that, maybe I've got an extra copy of that book that I'm willing to part with for $50. You see online that Aspen charges about $360 for it, so you think, $50 sounds like a good deal to me. You apparently value that book at least $50 or more. I'm willing to part with that book for that, so I apparently value the $50 more than I value the book. So when we make that transaction, do you see how now you are better off because you have a book that you valued more than your $50, and I'm better off because I have $50 that I valued more than my book? Get it? So that's how we know that we have deployed resources efficiently. We've got things into the hands of people who value them the most. And again, so far, so good, right? Here's the problem, though. Law often deals with involuntary transactions or coercive transactions, crimes, accidents, eminent domain, many other things that the law deals with constantly are not voluntary, but they are involuntary. So they're coercive. So what we have to do is we have to say, well, in that situation then, how can we possibly determine whether we're efficiently deploying these resources? How can we determine we're maximizing societal wealth since it's not a voluntary transaction? The answer is, I don't know if it's still popular. I don't think it's as popular as it was. There's a period of time where Christians would wear little bracelets and things that said WWJD, and we're supposed to say, what would Jesus do? Not necessarily a bad thing to ask yourself, what would Jesus do? Probably a good thing, as long as you remember that he's God and you're not, and there'd be some different settings maybe where he would act a little bit differently than you because of that. Taking all that into account, not a bad thing to ask yourself. Well, what law and economics scholars do, they've sort of got their answer to that too, but it's not what would Jesus do, it's what would the market do. So what we're supposed to do when we're faced with an involuntary transaction is ask ourselves, if the market could act, if the market could do something here, what would it do? And then we should do that. Because if we do that, then we will know that we've acted efficiently. We've maximized societal wealth. We've allocated resources to the people who value them the most. Now, you add in with that a little bit of things like cost-benefit analysis, supply and demand, et cetera, and you basically got it. And all you have to do is go and apply that to basically all areas of law and life. Now, again, I said I'm going to say this a few times. Free markets are great and biblical. I'm all for that. A wise person should engage in cost-benefit analysis, right? Jesus in Luke 14:28-32 says you don't want to start to build a tower and find out you can't build it. You don't have enough to finish it, right? That's cost-benefit analysis. That's that type of forward-looking planning. The same thing. Do I want to go fight this opposing king? Do I have enough military might to do that? Or do I want to send somebody to try to treat for peace? In fact, you probably did that tonight. I see that many of you at least had to sign an attendance sheet to show you were here. So you did a cost-benefit analysis, right? You could have done something else. You could have, right? You could have went somewhere else, done something else. And then what you would, so that would have been, you just say, well, the benefit is I want to go do X, Y, or Z, whatever it is you want to do. The cost would be whatever repercussions would fall on you for failing to be where you're supposed to be tonight, right? And you did that. You do that all the time. That's fine. Cost-benefit analysis is a good thing. And often, law and economics scholars arrive at the same types of conclusions that conservatives or libertarians do. In fact, law and economics is sometimes thought of as a conservative or libertarian view. Now, where I come from, that doesn't bother me one bit. I mean, just as total depravity doesn't mean we're all as wicked as we could be every single second, right? Then I don't think it means that people who are not Christians can never arrive at some type of truth, right? They can always get there. Or to say it pejoratively, like somebody might, where I grew up, a blind hog finds an acorn every once in a while, right? So, so it doesn't bother me that we arrive at the same conclusions. In fact, I'm fine with that. The problem is that we arrive at those conclusions for such markedly different reasons. And then at times then, that causes us on really important issues to arrive at very, very different conclusions. I guess due to my controversial metaphysical commitments and the fact that Posner, and again his self-declared neutrality, does not suffer from those. So with that, let's turn and take a look at the question, why is rape a crime? Or we might say, why is rape wrong? That's certainly a question of law and policy, right? So let me give you the answer from a law and economics perspective. Rape is wrong from a law and economics perspective because it is a purely coercive transaction that bypasses the market for sexual relations, where such bypass is not warranted because transaction costs are low. So why is rape wrong? It's because it bypasses the sex market. Now, okay, right? And just so that, remember that Richard Posner is most recently retired, but he was most recently the Chief Judge of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. This is a fantastically influential figure in law and policy. And just so you know that I'm not mischaracterizing what he says, I'm going to read to you directly from his book called An Economic Analysis of Law. He says this: rape bypasses the market in sexual relations, marital or otherwise, because some of that market is in the context of marriage. Some of it is outside of that. In the same way that theft bypasses markets in ordinary goods and services. So he's, that's right. That's what's wrong with theft too, is it bypasses the market in ordinary goods and services. He goes on to say this though, because we do have a problem here. We do have a problem here. Some rapists, he says though, derive extra pleasure from the fact that the woman has not consented. Sadly, for these rapists, there is no market substitute. I added sadly, too, because I'm kind of mocking in the way I read it, and I said I was going to give you exactly his words, so I shouldn't do that. So scratch sadly. For these rapists, there is no market substitute. Market transaction costs are prohibitive. And an economist might therefore argue that for them, rape is not a pure coercive transfer and should not be punished if the pleasure to the rapist, as measured, of course, by what he would be willing to pay, though not to the victim, for the right to rape, exceeds the victim's physical and emotional pain. Chief Judge of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. Economists should probably conclude that rape in some instances will be okay because we have what we call the utility monster. And the utility monster is the person who derives so much pleasure from whatever they do that it offsets all the suffering they cast onto other people from it. And therefore, from a utilitarian perspective, they should be allowed to do that. Now, Posner says, and he does say elsewhere in his book, it's impossible really to measure utility that way. We can't really get a pile up here and say, okay, here's how tall the pile is of pleasure that this rapist derives, and here's the pile of the pain he would cause, and look how much bigger his pile is. So he should be able to rape. But what we can do to try to avoid that is we can measure it by how much he would be willing and able to pay in order to rape. So Jeff Bezos, if he was, I assume he's not, but if he was so inclined, he should possibly, Posner goes on to point out in this passage, be issued a rape license by the government. Now, he says there are, of course, practical objections to that, such as these rapists are hard to distinguish empirically from mere thieves of sex, that giving them free rein would induce women to invest heavily in self-protection, which would in turn incite heavy spending by rapists to overcome that investment, and that there's no objective method for measuring the rapist's utility and the victim's disutility for the purpose of deciding which is greater. Now, so he's honest, and we got to give him credit for that. He's honest for admitting that under his worldview, his approach to law, there's really no good reason other than a few practical objections as to why we as a society should not grant a rape license. So, all right. Now, he goes on to say this, but the fact that any sort of rape license is even thinkable within the framework of the wealth maximization theory that guides the analysis in this book is a limitation on the usefulness of that theory. So we appreciate that honesty. What generates the possibility of a rape license is the fact that the rapist's utility is weighted the same as his victim's. If his utility were given a zero weight in the calculus of costs and benefits, a rape license could not be efficient. But he says such a weighing would be based on ethical rather than economic thinking. So what I'm going to tell you, what he's saying is, what I'm going to tell you to base your legal system on, what I'm going to tell you to determine questions of law and public policy is not even sufficient to tell you whether you ought to weigh identically or not the value, if you will, to somebody who is a rapist against the pain and suffering that rapist causes. So what would be the Christian answer to that question? I mean, this seems easy, right? But I've already given parts of it earlier. God is the ultimate arbiter of good and evil. He is justice. Justice is a reflection of God's righteous character. He's the creator of all and the ultimate sovereign over all the earth. He has revealed himself through his world and then through his word. And his word declares rape to be wrong and indeed a crime. Now, I'm just going to give you some Bible citations for that, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of that, just in issues of time. But Exodus 22, 16 through 17, and Deuteronomy 22, 23 through 29 would be the places you'd want to look to get a start on that. I will just say this, when you take a look there, if you've not already looked there, you may find it a little bit shocking. You may feel like that it doesn't give exactly the answer that you would like, and therefore I in fact know that a lot of Christians because of that do stay away sometimes from the biblical law and the answers it provides. Generally speaking, I'm going to give you a quick summary of what I think it teaches there. I think it teaches that forcible rape is a capital crime. So it's actually a capital crime. I mean, you think, well, that doesn't sound controversial at all. But then the Bible, right? I mean, although, okay. The Supreme Court has said, though, rape can't be a capital crime, so it is somewhat controversial. But then it goes beyond that to deal with some other areas where it looks like the punishment for rape is that you have to marry the girl you raped. Now, that's what can seem controversial. I'll give you my quick answer to that. I believe in the context that is a seduction and a consensual relationship. And so in a consensual relationship, the penalty would be if her father will give her to you, you, rapist, have to pay the bride price for her, then you have to marry her, and you can't divorce her. Now that sounds offensive on a number of levels to modern ears, right? But it's probably all I can say about that right now. All right? If you got questions about it when it comes up, you can ask me more, and I'll tell you more about it. But in one of my answers of what we should do about this whole thing, you'll see why I even bring that up, I think. Let me give you I want to give just a couple other examples. Here would be one. Since old people are really expensive at the end of their lives, and that's true, you'll probably cost more in the last 6 months of your life, statistically speaking, from a medical perspective, than you will in all the rest of your life put together and combined. It'll be a factor, too. So old people are really expensive right at the end of their lives, and, their lives don't have all that much value at that point anyway. Why can't we just euthanize them and save some money? Judge Posner, once speaking in the Tanner Lecture Series at the University of Utah, I believe it's the University of Utah, he actually said, well, basically the reason we can't do that right now is it's morally untenable to us. It's unthinkable. But he said that's not always been so. There's been several Native American societies, for instance, where when somebody gets really old and will be more costly than they can contribute, then you leave them under a tree while you go to the hunting grounds for the winter. And they just wait to die there. And that could be fine. Posner's a weak moral realist. He thinks morals are real, but he thinks they have no higher grounding whatsoever. They're just what we've kind of all agreed to at the time. And so he says, over time, we might change our mind, and we might not find that morally untenable anymore, and when we reach that point, it would be fine to do it. Christian answer, people are people, no matter how big, no matter how small, no matter how rich, no matter how poor, no matter how male, no matter how female, right? No matter how much they contribute to society or not. And you can't kill them. All right, let me do another one real quick. Why is marriage a good thing? I'll have to do this one really quick. Be provided for and protected by a legal system. Posner says marriage has an economizing function. It makes spouses more wealthy through the specialization of labor. It's kind of like a contract or a partnership. So all you young guys, if you're thinking about proposing, and you're going to follow the dominant jurisprudential thought system in the United States, you would say, well, my dear, I would like to ask you to marry me. I believe us working together would provide certain important economizing functions in our lives. It would allow us to specialize our labor, and by doing that, we would actually be wealthier, and therefore, will you marry me? Good, right? Okay. Why is marriage a good thing and to be protected in our legal system? Indeed encouraged, I would say, because it reflects the glory of Christ and His church. And a quick answer, right? And is a good thing, the foundational building block of society, indeed. So what about homosexual marriage then? Law and Economics says there's really nothing wrong with it, economically speaking. Judge Posner did formally caution judges, though, not to rush ahead on homosexual marriage. He said, we don't want to rush into the same mistake that we made with regard to abortion. And he said, the mistake that we made with regard to abortion, and this is the RDC version of what he said, right? I'm not quoting. The mistake we made was not that we authorized the slaughter of tens of millions of unborn humans. That's not what we did. The mistake was that the court rushed ahead of the rest of the society. And the court has to think about maximizing its wealth, if you will, as well. And the court's wealth is often found in how much the society is willing to put stock in its decisions, right? And by rushing ahead of society, the court courted controversy. It brought controversy on itself, whereas what it should have done is just waited. So he said, on homosexual marriage, what we need to do is we don't need to rush ahead of society. We need to wait until the tide is turned in society. Once the tide is turned, we need to jump on that. That probably explains his, really what I would say was shameful behavior for a judge when he had perceived the tide had turned in 2014. And the case of Baskins v. Bogan came before the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which it did end up upholding a fundamental right to homosexual marriage. That case did. That one's not the one that eventually made it to the Supreme Court. But he behaved really, I would say rudely to the lawyers who were arguing for Indiana had an amendment to their constitution, marriage amendment, like a lot of places had. He behaved rudely. At times he would do things like this when they were talking. He would go and turn his head up and shake his. It's in a way I've virtually never seen a judge behave in a courtroom. But he was going out of his way to show that he believed, he believed what he thought. He was on the right side of history, and he was going to demonstrate that because now society had turned and there was no danger of rushing ahead. So what should we do then? What should we do given that law and economics dominates discussions of law and policy in this country? Most of us don't even know about that. Most Christians don't even know about it, so they much less couldn't have any type of response to it. So what are some things we should do? Well, the first thing I would encourage you to do is seek to really understand God's views of justice. Seek to understand God's views of law and policy, and I would submit that means really seeking to understand biblical law. I mean, that's where we get a lot of God's manifestation of what is good and holy and righteous in the realm of law and policy. I would say that also means then repenting of being embarrassed by and apologetic for God's law. I mean, I see a lot of Christians who, when they will try to take some type of stance for God's law, the first time somebody on Facebook or something says something like, well, yuck, 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 I guess we're not going to eat shrimp or pigs then, right? And what do? We kind of hang our head, oh, that's right. I'm sorry, it's so ridiculous. You know, it's like we don't have an answer for these things. An answer to that one in particular is so fantastically simple, but we're embarrassed of God's law because it contains things, I think we as a society have grown beyond. So it's sort of like we have to apologize for God and His sort of outdated, antiquated views. And I would suggest as long as we feel that way, we are going to get nowhere. Christians should love and celebrate God's law. Read Psalm 119 if you don't agree. I mean, just read it, and don't read it. The way we normally take that is, Psalm 119 is an ode to the Bible. Isn't that kind of how we normally take that? It's an ode to the Bible. Well, indeed it is. I mean, but what was if it's David, what was David really talking about a lot of times there? Primarily the Pentateuch, right? I mean, he was talking about God's law. So that is an ode to God's law. We want to love the things that God loves and hate the things that God hates. So we can't be apologetic for God's law. And I had shrimp just last night. So I eat shrimp. If you were at Life Beyond College, you know that I have 4 pigs at home. These pigs are good friends of mine. When I come out and feed them, I scratch their bellies and their heads, and we spend and I will eat them. That's the plan. We're going to eat them. And Pastor Wilson, I know I've heard him say before on it was Ask Doug's, I think, that he thinks maybe animals will be in heaven. So, Pastor Wilson, I usually quote you a little bit on that, and then I say, if you're right about that, it's going to be awkward for me and the pigs when we first meet, because when I first get there, and they're Orange Vanilla Coke, that's the name of one of the pigs right now. I can imagine him being like, well, come on, what are you doing? You're acting like you're my friend. You're scratching me above my tail, and I like that when I straighten my little pig tail out when you're doing that. And then here I am one day, all of a sudden I'm in your freezer. I figure we'll work it out in heaven. We'll have the benefit of the absence of sin and all that. It'll be fine. The Lord will help us. Another one that I've hinted at is reject the myth of neutrality. There's nothing new. You've heard. I mean, I know I'm preaching the choir on many of those things, but one of the brilliant moves that the secularists have pulled is they have declared themselves to be neutral. So Posner has declared himself to be neutral. So he gets to look at me and he said, well, you can't speak into this because you're not neutral. You've got these controversial metaphysical commitments. Well, he doesn't really want to make any metaphysical commitments if he can help it. That's what he thinks at least. But he does. His commitments are that God has not spoken, that evolution is true. And he does sort of own these things in other places. So it's nature red in tooth and claw. One wonders why rape would be wrong at all in that setting. Because wouldn't I be wiser, evolutionarily speaking, if I passed my genes on to as many offspring as I possibly could, right? Isn't that what it's all about? So that gets then, I guess the one that I would say, I got 2 more actually. This one's real and the last one's kind of a joke. But I would then call the secularists to own their worldviews and stop using mine without admitting it. When I go to an ABA meeting, American Bar Association meeting, when you go to the legal academy is fantastically liberal. So I'm almost always talking to people who are hostile to Christianity. At worst, maybe at best, they're just indifferent to it. There's a way to do that, I think, while being winsome, though. I attempt typically to do that with a big smile on my face. So if we were to start talking about something like this, I would say, I'm a Christian. I believe the Bible is completely true, and God created the world, and He's the standard of law and justice. So that's why I believe that's wrong. But why do you believe it's wrong? And then just let them talk and ask them questions. And if you do that, you can do it by now. It'll get uncomfortable at times, particularly if you ask some hard questions when they start providing, what are often pretty lousy answers. But I think being willing to do that is one of the things that we ought to do. So we can't be apologetic for our source of law and government, and we have to be willing to push other people on what their source is. And then lastly, what you can do is after you graduate, you can come to Liberty University School of Law, right, to be trained as a minister of justice so that you'll be better equipped to handle these things in our time. I'm a member of the admissions committee, I have been for years, and we are accepting applications for the fall of 2020 and beyond right now. So, all right. I wanted to end a little early if I could. I almost hit 3:45, so we have more time for questions. So that's good. Thank you.
To me, every week. I wouldn't get into the law school, obviously. You,
Me over here.
yeah, you can't even unwrite them. So let's start there at the Liberty Law School,
Okay.
in your training of future lawyers. You said right at the beginning, the person who, the people who set the rules and draw out the pitch, they own the game.
Mm-hmm.
It's their game. And the principle of law and economics is the guiding principle there.
Mm-hmm.
So you're training up Christians to enter into a system that is the rules already set. How do you prepare them? They've got to, in one sense, play by rules that others have set, which they don't agree with, and yet at the same time try and subvert them. How does that work?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that we do, I tell virtually all the students, every class I've got, I tell them, or if they've had me before, I remind them, we have a harder job than they have at Harvard or UVA or Yale or wherever else. We have a harder job than they do because we have to learn the law as it is just as good as they do. We need to know it just as well as they do. We got to be just as good of lawyers as they are. Then what we have to do beyond that is we have to understand the historical foundations of that from the Western legal tradition, which was based unequivocally on a Christian worldview. And then we have to understand even where that was wrong, where that was correct, and then what it should be. And we have to work really, really hard to do all those things. And then so that's the way we would want to train and equip them. And then when you go into that, you ask, well, how do you begin to change something like that? Well, I mean, ultimately, the answer is the gospel in the sense that we often mean, which is God has to come in and change somebody's heart. I think if we had perfect laws, that wouldn't fix it if we were a people with uncircumcised hearts. And I think I've got a very good historical example for that. God gave the nation of Israel a set of laws. If God actually gave you your set of laws, how could you have a more perfect set of laws than that? They had a perfect set of laws, and yet they rebelled against God because their hearts were uncircumcised. So ultimately, it's in the gospel, but God works through a number of means. And prior to about 1900, the United States, in a lot of ways, still had a legal system very much based solidly on a biblical worldview. So these are changes that have happened, in our lifetimes. They've happened in a very short period of time. And so if God is kind enough to grant us reformation, we could see it change back really quick. And it would change back the same way it changed, through a number of people going out doing what God's given them to do in whatever area of law it is, and doing that faithfully to God's word. In fact, one last thing is that one of the reasons that law and economics has so dominated the field is it dominates the law schools. That's one of the places that it really came first to dominate, was to dominate the law schools. And so once you dominate, so a lot of people go to law school. I did this. You go to a secular law school. I never even knew that I was being taught from a law and economics perspective. I didn't know that. Nobody told me that. I mentioned at the Life Beyond College event that they would, Blackstone's commentaries of laws of England were used to train most lawyers in the United States prior to somewhere around the turn of the century. It's full. Blackstone says things like a law in contravention of God's law is no law at all. It's absolutely full of Scripture. In a secular law school, you will read some Blackstone, but they will make sure to edit every bit of that out. I did not know Blackstone quoted Scripture until I got out of law school. Yeah.
So how would you train someone? So we talked about it the other night, the recent legal opinion in the UK.
Yeah.
That man made in the image of God is no grounds for any legal opinion.
Correct.
In any case. So how as a Christian do you go in there and how do you train your people to go in there and argue for a biblical outcome of justice without relying on a biblical
Sure.
text?
Yeah, and we've had students over the years that have differing opinions on how they feel like God's asking them to go about doing that. The majority of students, you're going to learn the rules of legal argumentation, and then you're going to make arguments. So you know what the answer should be, and then you're going to use these tools consistently with that. We have had some students over the years who feel like God is really convicting them that what they should do is, even though they are going to lose, is go in there and make expressly biblical arguments. So I think there's different approaches to that. But I usually, if you don't know where you're going, then there's virtually no chance you're going to get there. So if you don't know what the answer is, then there's no chance you're even going to get there. With any, no matter what the argumentation is. So there's different. I would say there's those two different views that have developed on that. Most of the students understand that they're going to go out into a world where, particularly when they're arguing before a court, they're going to be making the types of arguments that courts will listen to, which in the time we live in does not involve, Exodus 23 says this. I think when you get beyond that, though, and you're not in those settings, there are opportunities to make arguments that are more expressly biblical. And I sort of gave an example of what I do when I deal with other law professors. So usually I guess it's just presuppositional apologetics applied to law. But usually what I do is I want to talk to them about. So so we both agree rape is wrong. If we were talking about that, well. Here's the reason I believe that. Why do you believe that? And then when they start answering that, one of the things that's very helpful is you can sort of show them the vacuousness of their view of law. There is no basis for human rights. And sometimes your biggest enemies can be, what looks like your biggest enemies can be then wonderful helps on that. So I think about, for instance, Peter Singer, who would say that if this building were burning down, and you happen to know that there's a family of mice living in a spot, and you also know that there's a severely mentally handicapped person in another place, and you've got time to rescue one or the other, you should rescue the mice because they're more sentient, they can plan the future better, they can understand loss better, and therefore they're more worthy of protection individually and in the eyes of the law than the mentally handicapped person. Well, most Americans are going to find that type of thing absolutely abhorrent. Even now, we've got enough fumes of the Christian worldview in the tank that we think that's absolutely abhorrent. So when you start to point some things like that out and say, well, how would you reason? I mean, here's how it's easy. The person's made in the image of God. I'm going to save them. But how do you get to that? Why do you know that Peter Singer's wrong? And honestly, many times they don't have good answers.
Okay, I'm going to open up. Pastor Wilson. Pastor Wilson, there is a microphone, so I think it will help. Sorry. Don't forget your question.
So you mentioned conservatives and libertarians sharing values on the sale of widgets and free markets, yay, free markets. As we're up against this law and economics thing in the law, do you worry at all, or would you have any comments to make about Christian libertarians leaving a back door open for law and economics to come in and reduce everything to market transactions instead of saying there are some things that are not for sale?
Yes, I mean I do, and I think I actually see that among a lot of a lot of really serious young believers, at least where I'm at in Central Virginia, and many who come through the law school, not all, but we have a very strong contingent that are extremely libertarian. So I'm in the 5th District of Congressional District in Virginia. That's where we live in Bedford. Our congressman just pulled a normal play on us. So he was running, he's a businessman, he was running for Congress for the first time. So he came around to all the conservative Christians, and the 5th District in Virginia is extremely conservative, got a lot of real biblical people who love the Lord and want to see that in law. He comes around begging all of us for votes. Once he gets elected, he doesn't waste any time at all in performing a homosexual marriage. So he actually performed one. And so he's basically just told us to get over that. You don't want a Democrat, do you? Now, a funny thing that he has managed to do with that is he has split the Christians in our district between the libertarians and then what are the more traditional conservative Christians. So I do worry about that. I actually think, well, on the marriage issue, I think there's several good answers as to why the civil magistrate can't ignore marriage. That's what the libertarian friends of mine typically want. They want the civil magistrate to just get out of that. I would say you can't ignore marriage because God built it into the fundamental fabric of the world, and because it's so part of the fundamental fabric of the world, a legal system is going to have to take account of it. And there's some examples of that. Legitimacy of children. Right now, the law is that there's a presumption that if children are born into a marriage, that they are the biological children of both the wife and the husband in that marriage. So we're going to undo that. The ownership of property, the passing of property. There's so many things that marriage is just fundamental to, that in some way or another the civil magistrate has to take recognition of it. The other thing I think that we try to, so I didn't talk about what I think are the pieces of a Christian worldview of law, but one of the things that I see recurring in almost any issue of law and policy is reasoning from generals to particulars. So God has given general standards. Biblical law is often paradigmatic law, meaning it gives you a paradigm. It's not a civil code. It doesn't provide all the answers. So what you do is you reason down from generals. Sometimes you even reason from particulars God has given you up to what generals are, and then you use those generals elsewhere. So that's part of what we do. That can really only be done in a Christian worldview. There's no reason for Richard Posner to think that ought to work in his worldview. Another one then is the jurisdiction of the civil magistrate. So jurisdiction really just kind of literally from its root means the power to speak the law. So who has the power to speak the law in an area? Sometimes the civil magistrate has that. Sometimes the church has that. Sometimes the family has that. Sometimes the individual has that. And while the Bible doesn't delineate that in every detail, it does give us some good guidelines to say what should the civil magistrate be about, and what should the family, the church, other institutions be about. And then the last one is judicial versus prudential reasoning. So judicial reasoning is reasoning like a judge. You find a standard, you look back at the conduct that happened in the past, and you say, did this meet this standard or fall short of it? Prudential reasoning is where you look ahead and you say, what is a good idea? What should we do? So legislatures should do prudential reasoning. Judges should do judicial reasoning. Now, so take all that to say an example that I've had libertarians like that ask me when I've taught jurisprudence and law and economics is, well, homosexuality then. So what? It doesn't hurt anybody. There's no victim in that. So since it doesn't hurt anybody, you should be able to do whatever you want to, right? So how could that be wrong? If you've got a consistent biblical standard, though, it's very clear under biblical law that homosexuality was certainly wrong, even a crime. And now comes the gasps, right? I mean, not here, but in the world we live in, the gasp comes, right? Oh, yeah, my goodness. Well, Western society, for almost the whole history of the Western legal tradition, has thought that homosexuality was a crime. It's thought that adultery was a crime, right? And so I think it's calling them back to take as their standard not a libertarian philosophy, but rather that we're going to take the Bible as our standard for that. but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. In fact, it's somewhat intimidating for me to be asked a question by Doug Wilson, I'll just tell you, because, I mean, I view Doug Wilson as a hero of mine. I told him once, I quote him all the time when he was at our church in Lynchburg, and he said, I said, but I footnote you when I do. I tell people Doug Wilson said that, and he said, oh, no, don't do that. He said, you'll just get me in trouble, and he said, that way you'll be the one getting in trouble if you just say it, so. All right.
Okay. Tom. And then after Tom, Mr. Brainerd. And after Mr. Brainerd, Aidan, we're going to be over here to Eston, okay?
Mr. Chrisman, are you aware of the whole fairness for all movement in Christian colleges, and can you speak to that at all?
And, well, you want to clarify what you mean by that, so I make sure we're talking about?
CCCU is pushing a doctrine or a legislative effort called Fairness for All,
okay,
with regard to the whole SOGI issue. Are you aware of that? And do you have any comments on that?
I'm not aware of what they're doing. So it's regarding what issue? I've got comments on everything. Typically, I'll just have to figure out what it is. You know,
sexual orientation. And gender identity.
Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know if it's actually in the book, the Little House on the Prairie book, but I know it's in the pilot. Where they get these new little horses as they're going out to the prairie, and their Pa tells them that one's a boy and one's a girl, and so he's telling them, we're gonna have a colt. And Laura, somebody says, well, this one's the girl, and then Laura says, and that one's the boy, and she's bent down, kind of looking under the horse, and Ma Ingalls she's like, Laura, And Pa says, well, she'd be in trouble, Caroline, if she didn't know the difference between a boy and a girl. And it seems like to me that's sort of the position we're in on that is we've got the people who want to run the world don't know the difference between a boy and a girl. I presume if a calf was born on our farm, they wouldn't be able to tell me whether that calf is a little bull calf or it's a little heifer calf until it gets up so it can start to think enough and it can make its own decision about what its identity is. I mean, it's so patently ridiculous in a way, isn't it? But then when but I get it then. I mean, if I'm with professors from other ABA law schools, they think I'm horrendous for talking that way. Most of them do. So I guess, and I mean, to go beyond that, we're not facing that from, I guess is that the classical Christian colleges group? Okay, Communion Christian. Yeah, so we're not, I'm not aware of us facing pressure at Liberty, at least yet, from that group. I don't think we're actually a part of that group. I'm not sure why. I don't know the details of it, but we very much are facing pressure, have faced pressures from our regulators about that, and we will face more pressure from that. And so I guess my answer is it's absurd, and then my answer is that but it does have teeth, because I know people who have been denied admission to bars because they tried to transfer from one bar to another, and they were questioned about those views like that, and their application to transfer was denied. So we're living in a time where these folks are not kind and gentle. They're going to come after us, and so probably the best answer we've got is to make as strong a stand as we can against it. Yeah.
Eston.
So kind of thinking back for a, say, attorney or, say, a police officer, I mean, obviously there are some laws where if you don't follow them, then you're not going to make any traction, and frankly, you're going to make things worse. Mm-hmm. But are there any laws that, in spite of how much traction you get, or in spite of, say, how worse things get, mm-hmm. You should, say, as a prosecutor, prosecute abortion? Because on the sole basis that, regardless of what men say, it's still murder.
Yeah, I would love to see that. I mean, I would love to see a Commonwealth. I would love for the Bedford Commonwealth Attorney. So I live in Bedford County in Virginia. I would love to see for the Bedford Commonwealth Attorney say we're gonna prosecute abortions. We're gonna prosecute abortionists. Now, fortunately I live in a town where there is no abortion provider. So I guess we'd have to move to Lynchburg or Roanoke where there is one. I would love for them to prosecute that, even if they're gonna lose. But I would have to trust. I mean, for them, I would say for them, it's they would have to pray and determine what God would have them to do on that, whether they think they can do more good by challenging that or not. But I would love to start to see some. So it's just the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. The lesser magistrates begin to stand up to these greater magistrates to say we're not going to take it. I think it's a great idea. Then in our own lives, I think we submit to the civil authorities in the Lord, and so we each have got to determine what that is, because we all live. I think I mentioned at the event last night too, but there's been several attempts to count the federal crimes, the number of federal crimes we have. One would think if something's a crime, we ought to be able to figure out how many they are and list them, right? The federal government and agencies outside the federal government have tried and failed to count the number of federal crimes. They are too vast. Virtually everybody in here, you're probably in violation of some crime or not, and it's at the whim of the prosecutor whether to prosecute you or not. And that's a state of unimaginable tyranny, really. So I don't know how much that fully answers your question. Yes, I would love to see people do that. I tell everybody who runs for sheriff in Bedford County, if they come to take my guns, it is your duty to be at my house there protecting me when they show up. That's your duty. And I tell them that my view of the Second Amendment is it's an anti-tyranny amendment, so I think it ought to allow me to have a howitzer, a surface-to-air missile. It ought to have me just about have anything. Because my 30-06, it would be useful. It would be useful if the government came to get me. But couldn't we all agree that a rocket-propelled grenade launcher would be more useful, right? So I think, right, it'd be even more useful. So I tell that to Mike Brown is our sheriff. He's not running anymore. He's retired. And I've told him that repeatedly. Probably shouldn't say it on a recording. He's assured me privately that he will be there to protect me if they show up. So we've got some new candidates running for sheriff now. And the first chance I get, I'm going to tell them that too.
I'd come with my truncheon. Yeah. Just wanted you to know. Everyone's laughing at me when you were answering that question, being the British. Ethan? Yes, Ethan. And then Cheyenne at the back after Ethan. Pass it along, pass the parcel. There you go.
Yeah, I was just curious, can you think of any laws that we have currently that are a good example of taking an exegetical kind of application of some of the biblical law that has to do with kind of ensuring the conditions of human flourishing? So I'm thinking of like the laws of you have to have a barrier on like certain house or on certain roofs. And then also like for a bull that's known to gored people, you have to have certain protections with that as well. And so I'm wondering any laws that are a good application of that, and then any laws that would kind of overstep or go too far with that.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great question, by the way, and that's something that we talk about quite a bit. So I'll take the parapet around the roof. An initial question in my mind is the parapet around the roof is so I'd want to look and I'd want to say what type of law is that. One option is that it's the type of law where it mandates what everybody has to do. And then we would have a group of Levitical priests who would be the parapet commission. And so the parapet commissioners would go out around to all the houses and make sure there's parapets around the roof. Now parapets, so first you see, the other option would be is that's a standard of, so it becomes a liability standard. So the way that would work is you don't have a parapet around your roof, somebody falls off your roof, and then what we look and say is, well, that's strict liability. We know the answer to that. You are liable. And so penultimate thoughts on that, meaning my thoughts as far as I can get them right now, because this is the type of things we debate and talk about, and we should talk about as Christians. I'm uncomfortable with the idea that there was the Parapet Commission. That doesn't seem to make sense to me, and that's often used for like support of zoning, for example. That zoning, so now the burning question is not a parapet around your roof, but it might be a fence around your pool, right? Because pools are, so the common law developed a standard that was not everybody has to fence their pool, But it developed a standard that basically said pools are attractive nuisances. And so the meaning that they're a danger to people around you, but they're attractive particularly to children. So if you don't have and I'm oversimplifying a bit, but if you don't have a fence around your pool, you are liable when somebody comes and dies in your pool. You see how that would use it as a liability standard. And a condition of human flourishing, that's an interesting way to put it. I mean, I think those are true. I think part of the problem is when you reach the point in a society where it's not based on loving each other anymore, then what we want to turn to is we say we need a list of rules, and we need somebody who's going along checking off those rules. And once we have that, we'll be safe. But, I mean, we manifestly won't be safe. That's a hope and something quite apart from God. So I think a good attempt at a good attempt at an application for that is thinking, well, we'll pass a law that says you have to have a fence around your swimming pool. I think a better application of that is the common law standard that basically says if you don't have a fence around your swimming pool and a child comes over and dies in your swimming pool, you are liable. You are strictly liable. You can't, well, they weren't watching their kid good. No. We're not going to hear any of that. You dug a pit and somebody fell in it. You're liable. You had a goring ox that you knew was a goring ox and he got out and gored somebody. You're liable. And I think that's a better application of that.
Cheyenne.
So as far as getting into a career in law, I've received a lot of discouragement from getting into law because of the limited job availabilities, and especially with the pressures that are put on, I guess, Christians going into law and the limitations of, job availabilities. Would you still encourage, Christian students to study law and to seek employment?
Well, full disclosure, if Christian students don't do that, I'll have to find a different line of work, which I'm okay with. But, I should tell you that up front, shouldn't I? So you understand the answer. But trying to put self-interest aside, though, I really do believe, I wouldn't be teaching at the law school if I didn't believe that Christian students should do that. I think it's absolutely critical that we do that. And I can answer that on two fronts. One, I could attack the pragmatic side of it, and I'm willing to do that. So in a minute, I'll make a couple of pragmatic comments. First, though, I would make what I think are more principled comments. A number of decades ago, the church decided, by and large, we decided getting into politics and legal issues and all that, that's messy business. The best thing we ought to do is just get out of that. It's much more important to have missionaries in it than that. Well, okay. And then now we find ourselves where we are today, right? So I would say it's the same thing with law and policy. To say that we're not going to go into law, that maybe there's not good job prospects, or this is tough stuff, or it might cost a whole lot, and to say that we're going to abandon an important area where part of what Christ is doing is establishing justice in the world. The distant coastlands are supposed to hope in his law. To say that we're going to give up that part of the gospel because it maybe is inconvenient or whatever, I think is always a bad answer. But I would go, and I'm not attacking you with that. I know people say that. People told me don't go to law school. I've never regretted going to law school. Beyond that, I would say there are always jobs for good attorneys. Competent attorneys never want for work. You can always find work to do. In addition to that, unlike a lot of areas of graduate school, if you make good grades and you do well on the LSAT, you can go to law school for free. So you don't have to come out of law school with this mountain of debt. In fact, it's one of the things I'm proud of at the law school. I think the data just came out. We have the 6th lowest debt burden of people coming out of law school at Liberty, and I'm really proud of that we're not. We're regulated by the ABA. If you want to have people be able to sit for the bar exam, you have to be ABA approved. And so when you're ABA approved, that sort of brings in you have to be a part of the whole Department of Education deal. So obviously we have student loans and that type of thing. The way the current setup is with that. If I gave you a law degree without ABA approval, you couldn't take the bar except in a handful of places, and that's going to make that law degree pretty worthless. So that's the answer. When I entered law school, terrible legal market. People were saying, why are you going to law school? I've never regretted it. And I think it is a absolutely fantastic degree to get, whether you work in law or not. My law degree helped me to learn to interpret the Bible because it taught me to be careful with words, treat a text carefully. It taught me to question assumptions, to question everything. I mean, it was an enormously helpful degree for me to get. So I can give you a bunch more reasons why to go to law school, I guess. I think you all should apply to law school.
And liberty in particular.
The liberty. Why? The same reasons you came to NSA are the reasons you shouldn't go to a secular law school. Why would you want a bunch of secularists teaching you about the law, right? You want people who believe the Bible are true and love the Lord Jesus Christ. That's who you want to teach you about the law. Okay.
Next question. Nick.
This is kind of awkward speaking in front of camera.
Yeah.
So first question.
Behind the camera.
Okay, behind the camera. Sorry.
We're speaking behind the camera to people in front of the camera. Yeah, there you go.
Sorry. Okay.
That's right.
So I have two questions, and first one is kind of broad, but as a Christian who studied law, what's your position toward the trade war between United States and China? And the second question is that how should we act toward a country like China who never listens to the global law?
Oh, man. Okay, let me do generally speaking, I think tariffs are a bad idea. So generally speaking, I think tariffs are a bad idea. It's almost like I have to answer, and I'm no international law scholar, so let me say that up front. I'm no immigration law scholar, but I did mention earlier I've got an opinion on everything. So, all right. So I think generally tariffs are a bad idea. I do recognize that China is, in that sense, a bad actor on the world stage. So they do engage in anti-competitive behaviors. Right now, we in the West finance the rest of the world with regard to intellectual property because the rest of the world just steals the property, and they're terrible they won't do anything about that. And so all of us in here finance intellectual property for the whole world because we have to pay enough for it to support it completely because a bunch of people around the world who get it. So I say all that to say that I'm not convinced in that setting that perhaps there isn't a good use for tariffs. And then I would quickly admit I don't know enough of the data to know whether this is a good example of a time we should use it or not. I would say that China has a lot more to lose than we do from a trade fight. I've joked before and said, who's going to buy their cheap plastic junk? That's their concern, right? And we're the ones who buy it. So if we stop buying it, that would be a tremendous problem. And we're seeing that. Their economy is struggling. It just came out in the Wall Street Journal today. I think they had the lowest growth rate since they've started tracking it. So it is having an impact on them. The way I would say that generally the way the United States used to approach international law and immigration and those types of things are the way that I would say is we had more of the right answer on that. We thought we're not going to go around being the world's policeman. We're not going to go meddle in everybody's business. And we're going to trade with everybody that will trade with us reasonably. We're going to be willing to trade with everybody. And then only when something that would satisfy just war theory ideas comes about, are we going to become involved in some type of military conflict or something like that. So I would generally my answer of where we need to get to is that. And I don't always know how to get to that from where we sit right now, you know what I mean? So it's the same way on immigration. I think the Bible supports open borders. I think that's actually the right idea. You know, somebody hears that and think, oh my goodness, and you said you taught at Liberty University. You know, but well, yeah, I mean, I think generally open borders is the right answer. But right now we've got such a big mess because we give away all these freebies and things like that. And we've got this crazy idea that if you just happen to be born on American soil, that means you're an American citizen. I would reason from the way we do it in the church. So there's two ways to become a member of the church. There's you join it as an adult, and the other way is you're born into it. That's why we baptize babies, right? So you're born to American parents or an American parent. That would make you an American. Or you want to come and join our covenant. That's how you get there. So it's like, it's the old saying is, we usually use it in the South to say if you're a Northerner and you move to the South and you have a kid here, that doesn't make that kid a Southerner. So that's what we normally use this for, but I'm going to apply it to Americans in general. And the old saying is, just because a cat has kittens in the oven, don't make them biscuits, right? So, right? And that's good. Aren't colloquialisms colorful? They're good, aren't they? I love them, so something to thank the South for, colloquialisms. But I think I would say just because you're born in America doesn't make you an American. It means that you want. So I know where we need to get, and then I can't. The hard thing a lot of times is how do we get from where we sit to that spot where we should be at. So I know that the federal government should not be involved in the housing market. Biblically, there's no way they should be involved in the housing market. Yet, they insure federal loans, they federally insure loans, I should say, that basically creates the housing market we currently have. And if they pulled out of that, banks wouldn't loan me and you money, good people, for a 30-year loan. Their jaw would drop open at that if they didn't think that a good slice of that the federal government is standing behind it. Now, the problem is, I don't know how to get from where we are to where we should be. It's a big old knot, and I don't know what to pull first, because what will happen to housing prices when I cut that cord and there's no longer 30-year mortgages? They will plummet. I mean, CEG, the financial crisis. That's what happened. The lending market seized up, and when it seized up, house prices plummeted. And so I don't really, you know what I'm saying? I don't know where to go to get there. But so maybe President Trump is truly brilliant or he's accidentally brilliant with the tariffs. I really don't know. And he's got, I'm sure, access to information if he reads it that I don't have access to. You know what I mean? I just don't know. I have no idea what he does. So maybe he's doing right, and we do see effects from it. I don't know for sure what the answer is. I think tariffs could be used appropriately. I generally think trade wars are a bad idea. I think what we ought to want to do instead is to be able to trade with everybody and not go try to stir their Kool-Aid all the time otherwise. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one last and brief question. Danny is that man.
How has Liberty Law not got kicked off the ABA?
We take that very, very seriously. So probably one of the ways is the, this would be one example. There'll be a chance for me to brag on Liberty too. Last year, we had the 5th highest bar passage rate in the whole country. So the schools that beat us, I think I've got them right, were Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and NYU. So we're in pretty good company there. Now here would be the difference. Their median LSATs are probably in the 160s or higher. Our median LSAT is, I think for that class maybe about 152, 153. So we're taking a lot of students that they wouldn't even take. We're taking them because they feel like God's called them to be a minister of justice, and we take seriously equipping them to that. We then have an extremely rigorous program such that they pass the bar in high numbers. So what we've sort of pursued the idea of we're going to try to be excellent enough that we don't give them any excuse to pull our accreditation. So I can give you an example. I had a lady who was on the ABA site team. She's a lesbian. That's widely known. She was at that time at Seattle's law school. And so she came to talk to me. I was a relatively new faculty member, and so she was looking for things like that. And so she said, but what about academic freedom? Like you don't really have academic freedom here, do you? You can't have academic freedom. And I mean, just think about the stuff I've said even sitting right here. How many law schools do you think are lining up to hire me to come and teach there? Right? I told her, I said, I've got more academic freedom here than I would have at any law school in the country. The types of things I want to research and think about and teach about, no other law school in the country would let me do. So we've got academic freedom in the old vein of academic freedom, which means you really can debate and talk about these things. Not everybody has to share a specific orthodoxy. And I tried to say that while smiling. Because that makes it more winsome, right? And so I said that. And we actually, good relationship. She loves the law, wants the law to do well, but she says a very different view. So what we've tried to do is be excellent enough in what we do to make sure that if they decide to pull our accreditation, they will have to do it because they are going to say it's because of your Christian views. It's because you stand with Christ. And if they pull it for that reason, then we'll take it. Right? Then we'll take it. Now, we'll fight it. As long as we can fight it. But we can also, we'll rejoice, right, for great is your reward in heaven at that point. But we don't want to give them any other reason to do it. Yeah, that's how.
Please thank Rodney Chrisman one more time.
Thank you all. It's been fun.